Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the never-ending struggle, where we show you from time to time and episode to episode the triumphs, the struggles, the victories, the defeats of the Catholic Church as she moves through history, with the intent, we sure hope, of inspiring you if you're down, encouraging you if you're up, and to show you that above all, history is the movement of God's will through time against the background of innumerable fallen and free wills like yours and mine. Tonight, we're dealing with what is, to me, sort of an interesting topic because it's amongst the first things I remember. Tonight, we're going to be dealing with the church in the 1960s in America. And it's quite an important topic, simply because in so many ways, what happened then set the course for where we are today. Now, it's important to remember, too, that as in every age, the church was not divided or separated from the world around her. So before we can understand what happened to the church, we have to know a little bit about what was going on in the culture, the state, and society as a whole. We will take as our jumping off point 1960, coincidentally the year I was born. The early 60s, ladies and gentlemen, were a lot like the 50s. They're not the 60s you think of. No hippies, no peace signs, nothing like that. No, in the beginning, the reign of John F. Kennedy was seen as, in some ways, a very progressive time because the civil rights battles were being fought. The president was coming up with all sorts of new programs designed to improve the life of people at home. The president's physical fitness campaign, the endowment for the arts, the endowment for the humanities, all these sorts of things. The Peace Corps, very much inspired by JFK. And because he was Catholic, a lot of people had settled down, were in a happy partnership. And really, JFK and his wife seemed to epitomize that. They were seen going to Mass, and yet at the same time, he had promised, early in 1960, before he was elected, he had promised the Houston Ministerial Association that he would not allow his religion to interfere with his public life. And so far as we know, it didn't interfere with his private life either. But that speech he made before the Houston Ministerial Association was a watershed moment in American Catholic history. Because when he got up and promised to them that he would not make his Catholicism affect what he did in office, he basically gave up any right to an independent voice for Catholic Americans. And that being the case, I think it's worthwhile reading something to you that was said by bits of a speech from the Archbishop Chaput, retired Archbishop of Philadelphia, in 2010. He made some very, very important points stemming from Kennedy's speech. Now, mind you, this is in 2010. Obviously, today, the President of the United States is also a Catholic. So this makes it even more important. During his talk, the Archbishop noted that there are currently, quote, more Catholics in national public office than have ever been in American history. But I wonder if we've ever had fewer of them who can coherently explain how their faith informs their work, or who even feel obligated to try. The life of our country is no more, quote unquote, Catholic or Christian than it was 100 years ago. In fact, it's arguably less so. And the reason for this, the Archbishop maintained, is that too many Christian individuals, Protestant and Catholic alike, live their faith as if it were a private idiosyncrasy, which they attempt to prevent from becoming a public nuisance. Something emerged in the United States and in countries around the world, the so-called counterculture. One of the first examples of this was in January of 1967 at Golden Gate Park, the famous Human Be In, which was a combination rock concert and free lunch. That acted as a prelude to what was called the Summer of Love. While that long, hot summer was burning elsewhere in the country, in San Francisco, the hippies descended on Haight-Ashbury. And the hippie movement sort of crystallized the alternative social kinds of things in San Francisco and the hard left politics in Berkeley. The reason why this is of some import today is that many of the older members of my generation still retain the values, they could be called that, of that long ago period. And many of those people are in positions of authority and influence in church, state, and society. So the idea that everything that had come before was wrong and had to be rejected, we're going to find a new way, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This was kind of burned into the mentality of an awful lot of people. And they questioned all sorts of things: traditional marriage, traditional gender roles, traditional everything. Drugs became a big part of it. And of course, the music of that period, starting with the British invasion by the Beatles in 1964, the rock and roll that emerged from that period, some of it's still very listenable too, nevertheless epitomized this escape from perceived reality, which many people have stayed on since that day. The fact that they're often now in positions of authority, as I've said, gives a particularly poignant air to the whole thing, especially to those who are stuck having to live with the results of their decisions. With one thing and another, the general moral standards of America dropped. But interestingly enough, there was nevertheless a hunger, especially on the part of many of the young people involved with the counterculture, for something better, something truer. One of the symptoms of that search was, believe it or not, the popularity of a book by an obscure English Catholic academic. The book was called The Lord of the Rings, and it took the counterculture kids by storm. Tolkien himself was sort of bemused as a very, very conservative monarchist, high Tory Catholic Englishman. He was very confused by all the fan letters and so forth he would get from very peculiar hippies and whatnot. He really didn't know what to make of it. But that same yearning would be experienced by an explosion of, for want of a better word, I can only call strange spirituality. The age of Aquarius had dawned, and all the strange things in the American closet, from astrology to, what became the New Age, Hindu cults of various kinds, Buddhism, Zen, all this stuff was embraced, at least for a short period, till some of them found out you actually got to do stuff other than sit back and enjoy the bliss. This exploded during the late 60s. And you had a growth also in communes. Young people going off to various rundown places in the cities or remote areas in the hinterlands to start new societies, new communities, new ways of living together. Well, what all of this pointed to was a deep, deep hunger for something more rewarding spiritually, for something truer than what Eisenhower's America had been able to give them. As Tolkien said, not just the cult of drugs and fainéants doing nothing, but a real yearning for color and cavaliers. And that's why you had in the same period the rise of things like the Ren Fair, the Renaissance Fair, and the Society for Creative Anachronism. So in all of this, You might think, as during similar eras like the Romantic Revolt, the early 19th century, we had large numbers of converts in various places during those periods. We didn't during the 60s, even though in a lot of ways the time was ripe. The mid to late 60s saw a lot of America's young people on spiritual quests of different kinds, in a way and in a manner that in times past had produced flocks of converts for the Catholic Church. They did not this time. And the reason was that at the very time that they were looking for something, we were busy. In 1965, 1966, it looked as though, for all the radical changes, the bringing of the guitar mass and all that, perhaps the church really would become more relevant to everyday life. Perhaps, maybe, could be, it would be a change for the better. A lot of people didn't think so and left the church, their faith shattered or shaken. A lot of people who perhaps have been very participatory in the works of the church ceased so being. And then you had a whole other set of people who, having seen their agendas promoted, very happily jumped in. It was an interesting time, the first half for Catholics in America, the first half of the 60s. It was filled for many with a great deal of optimism, a great deal of hope. Catholics were active in the civil rights movement. Catholics were even active in the promotion of the United Nations, trick-or-treating for UNICEF. But the various interests that Catholics had and concerns would be swallowed up as the decade went on by major difficulties. One of the problems that came out of the period is that once birth control was legalized in the United States, the desire for the church to reverse its teaching on birth control, even as the Anglicans had done in 1930, became bigger and bigger and bigger. And unfortunately, Pope Paul VI stoked the expectations by appointing a committee primarily of laymen to re-examine the church's teaching. And that committee recommended that the teaching be changed. Well, Paul VI was going to write an encyclical on it. And since he had been the apostle of changing everything, people thought he would follow the recommendation of his own commission. It didn't work that way. Instead, in 1968, he issued Humanae Vitae, which was an amazing document. It was a prophetic document in the sense that he predicted what would happen accurately if artificial contraception became widely accepted. He foresaw the rise in abortion. He foresaw the cheapening of the relationship between men and women. He saw so many terrible, terrible things. It's a document worth reading. And they have all come to pass in the years since then. It really is a sobering thought that a man who, let's say, who had been, if not wrong, and certainly misled on so many different things, was so incredibly intuitive when it came to this. Unfortunately, and this leads us directly to the Catholic crisis of the mid-60s. Unfortunately, when he issued Humanae Vitae, the reaction on the part of many in the Catholic hierarchy was negative. Whole hierarchies, such as in Canada, Belgium, Austria, Germany, disagreed openly and publicly and volubly with the teaching of Humanae Vitae, which, after all, was simply reaffirming the teaching of the church from the beginning, all the way back to the story of Onan. So, what do you draw from all this? Well, what it showed was that, in a lot of ways, the Catholic edifice that seemed so grand in 1960 had been hollowed out like a termite-ridden chair, the sort of thing that you sit on it and it collapses completely. And yet, Paul VI did nothing, really, to discipline those who dissented from Humanae Vitae. But a lot of other things are going on in the Catholic world. The liturgy, as I mentioned, they had begun to tinker with as early as 62. It became a free-for-all, quite honestly. Very many priests ignored the rubrics, did whatever they wanted. I was present myself at masses with Dixie cups of wine and French bread. It was a wild time in a lot of places. And it wasn't just the liturgy that had to be remade. Everything had to be remade, at least so a lot of clerics thought. Eucharistic adoration, Eucharistic devotions, gone. Marian devotions, the rosary, May crownings, gone. In so many places, things that have been the standby of communities, novenas, Corpus Christi processions, all the rest of it, gone. And done in a very nasty and insensitive way, to say the least, as was the case with the liturgy. You had a whole generation of quote-unquote young Vatican II priests who, if you weren't completely obedient to what was going on, was simply hateful, nasty, hateful. Now, that wasn't all that was happening, because both Catholic religious life and Catholic higher education, Catholic education in general, those in charge of these things felt that they needed to be completely revamped in accordance with Vatican II. And so they were. Order after order got rid of their habits, got rid of their rules, and went, well, crazy. At the Land O'Lakes Conference, the major Catholic universities of the country got together and basically agreed that they would no longer really put their Catholic identity first. Rather, they were more interested in what they called academic freedom. All over the country as well, to supposedly support the new liturgy. There were a lot of more or less radical changes to parish churches, as hallowed old high altars and side altars were ripped out, statues thrown away, beautiful vestments, Lord knows how many communion rails. And all of these things, having been donated by lay people at great expense, it was quite an unjust thing to do, in my humble opinion, to simply dispose of these precious treasures of the church that so many lay people had worked so hard to pay for, and which that generation of clerics had no problem disposing of. And for years, in junk stores and so on, you find all sorts of Catholic paraphernalia that had been thrown away by these people. But that wasn't all. Because education, Catholic education, was sort of tacitly decatholicized, you had one generation after another, raised with very little understanding of the Catholic faith. The 60s then, for the Catholic Church in America, was one of great rupture with the past, and great soul searching, great tail chasing, frankly, looking for something or other. And so it was that the young people of that time, looking for mysticism, looking for candles, looking for God, weren't going to find him if we could avoid showing him in a Catholic church. We were too busy trying lamely to be like them with our guitar masses and so on and so forth. It was quite literally a tragedy.